E-I-E-I-O. Sven the Viking had a farm. E-I. Hey, that's not how it goes. G'day to you, friends. Seamus here. We have a delightful tale for you today. I will tell you that it is a gray, dreck day here in the Southwest, but I hope the story warms us up. It is a summertime story, a wonderful old Norse folk story. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on an introduction except to say that it's about a grumpy farmer, his very patient wife, and the day that everything changed. This story is called The Farmer That Minded the House. Many hundreds of years ago, so many hundreds that I don't really remember, in the southern part of Norway, where the south coast meets the North Sea, a good day's walk in from the coast into the soft hills that surrounded the southern lakes and fjords of that land, there was a farm. And it was a right good proper farm too. On that farm, they raised cows and chickens and sheep and goats and pigs. And they raised all the food they needed to feed the critters, and they raised all the food they needed to feed the family. And they even raised enough food to sell some of it off in town for silver. All in all, it was a very happy, prosperous farm. And you would think that the farmer that owned that farm would be very, very happy. But he wasn't. In fact, he was one of the grumpiest people anyone knew from across the way. He was never happy with the crops that they got in. Even in a bounteous year of good crops, it could have been more. He was never happy with how many new cows and piglets he had. Even though it could have been a good year, it could always be more. He was never happy with the work that his workers did. He was always grumping at them, wasting a lot of time in the process. And most especially, he was never happy with the way his wife kept the house. No matter the fact that their house was pristine in the midst of a farm, and she always had good food and ale ready for him, he was just a grumpy man. And on one particular day, in the summertime, in the midst of taking down the hay, the farmer came in at the end of the day. He grumbled his way in the house, and he grumbled his way to the table, and he grumbled the way through his first mug of ale that his dear wife had brought him. And he kept going on and grumbling and just being miserable until finally his dear wife came up, leaned on his shoulder, and she said, "Oh, dear one, please just take a breath and enjoy what you have. I have an idea for you." And he said, "What's that?" And she said, "Tomorrow. Since so clearly, my dear, you need a rest. Tomorrow, how about you stay home and take care of the little bit of work that I do around the house? And I will go out with the workers, and I will take your good scythe, and I will go out and mow hay just like you did, so that you can have a rest doing just the few things around the house that I have to do every day." And the farmer thought that that was a wonderful idea. It would be like a vacation for him to just sit around the house doing nothing but, maybe churning some butter or whatever. And he agreed. So, of course, the next morning, up with the crack of dawn, and they had their breakfast, they had their oats, and all was good to go. And she came over and gave him a wee kiss on the cheek. And stepping out the door, she took up his big scythe and put it over her shoulder. And down the lane she went to join the workers out in the field mowing hay. And he finished up his breakfast that morning, and he set about doing the few things that he thought he might do around the house. Well, he gave it some thought, and he thought the first thing that he should do is churn the butter, because he knew they would need butter for supper. So he got out the churn, and he got the pan of settled cream that had been set out the night before, and he poured it in the churn, and he started to churn the butter. Well, of course, it was summertime, and it was a warm day, so he stopped churning, and he went and opened the door and went back and kept churning the butter. Well, a few minutes later, he started to get warm again, and he thought perhaps a cool mug of ale would be just the thing just water, to ease the day. And he went to the little keg up in the kitchen, and it was empty. So down he went to the basement of their cottage to tap a new keg of ale. And he took the hammer, and he took the tap, and he bang, bang, banged on the bug, and he had just opened the barrel when he heard a strange noise upstairs. And being the farmer that he was, he knew that noise was the sound of a pig walking around in his house. And of course, he realized he had left the door open and one of the pigs had wandered into their house. And the farmer thought, well, it doesn't matter, it's just a pig. But then he remembered the butter churn. And what if the pig turned over the butter churn? And oh, what a mess that would be. So he set the barrel down and he ran up the stairs with the tap in his hand. And sure enough, just before he got to the top of the stairs, he heard a crash and a bang and a glug, glug, glug. And sure enough, when he came up off of the staircase, there was the pig in the middle of their living room with the churn turned over, cream all over the floor, and the pig was lipping it all up happily away. Well, the farmer was so angry, he took the ale keg tap that he had in his hand and he threw it at the pig. and he got the pig right in the back of the rear end, and the pig squealed and ran out of the house, and the farmer chased after him and slipped and slid in the cream and picked up the tap, and in picking up the tap, he realized that he had left the barrel of ale open. So down the stairs he ran, and sure enough, just as he got there, the last few drops of that whole barrel of ale had leaked all over the basement floor. And he thought, what a predicament I am now. I've got ale soaking into one floor and cream soaking into another. What a mess. So he hauled himself upstairs and he got a bucket of hot water from the kitchen, and he started to clean up the mess as well as he could. And he realized he would have to get more cream so he could churn the butter. And getting more cream meant going out to the barn to where the cow was. And he remembered he hadn't turned the cow loose into the lower pasture to feed yet. So he took the churn right out to the barn thinking he would get more cream. And he got the cream and put it into the churn and set the churn aside. And then he thought, it's too late to take the cow all the way down to the pasture. How can I feed her without wasting time? And they realized, of course, that as many of the Norse did at that time, they lived in a fine turf-covered house set back against the hill. And he thought he could just walk the cow up the hill and over a plank and turn the cow loose on the roof of their house to eat the turf and the grass that grew there. And he thought that was a splendid idea. But first, he had to make the butter. So he got the churn and he got the cream into the churn, and he got to thinking, now wait a minute, I can feed the cow, but she needs water too. So he went to the well to draw up a bucket of water. But in drawing the water, he realized he had left the churn full of cream and that pig was still loose. So he went back to the barn and he took a length of rope and tied it around the churn and put the churn on his back, and then went back to the well to get the water. But of course, when he bent over to get the bucket of water, the churn spilled out, and now he had warm cream all down the front of him and all through his beard and his hair, and it had sullied the surface of the well. And things were just not getting any better. Well, he threw off the rope and he cast down the churn, and he said, I'll feed the cow and get over with. And he went and he turned the cow out and brought her towards the house, and he led her up onto a little bit of a slope, and he put a plank from the edge of the hill up onto the edge of the house, and he led the cow up onto the very roof of their house where the turf was growing happily in the summertime. And as he came down off the roof, he thought, she's a silly cow. If I leave her up there and she gets hungry, she might eat her way all to the edge and fall off. So he took the rope that he had tied the churn up, and he walked up the hill and across the plank, and he tied one end of the rope around the cow's collar, and he threw the other end of the rope down the chimney into the cottage. And then he came down off of the hill, picked up the churn, dragged it into the house, and seeing the rope, he took the rope, and his thought was he would tie the rope around one of his own ankles. So if the cow tried to slip off of the rope, he would know it and he could pull her back. And this is where the story changes, because by the time all of this had happened, half of the day was gone. It was getting on to lunchtime by now, and there was no food for the workers. Normally, the farm wife would bring down a meal for her husband and the workers, but the husband was back at the house, and she was out in the fields. And she said to the workers, I will go to the house and see where luncheon is. And as she came up the road, she went through the gate, up the pathway to their door, and was quite surprised when she looked up just in time to see their cow, who was munching happily on their roof, fall off the roof and was dangling by a rope tied around her collar. Well, she has to protect the cow, so she ran up with her husband's scythe over her shoulder, and she swung that mighty hay scythe, severing the rope, and you heard a boom as the cow hit the ground. But just as the cow went boom, from inside the house you heard, ah! And running into the house, what did the farm wife see but her husband upside down with his feet in the air, with his head in the cauldron of hot water, because when the cow had fallen, she had pulled him up the chimney, and when the farm wife cut the rope, he had fallen back down and was now having a bath that he never planned on having. She ran into the house just as he kicked the cauldron over, and he spilled it onto the floor, and now water and ashes were everywhere. The fire was half out. The farmer was stunned. He didn't know where he was or what he was doing. The farm wife picked him up, put him in his chair, immediately set to righting the cauldron, building the fire back up, and cleaning up the mess. And while the husband sat there in his shocked stupor, he watched in amazement as how in just a few minutes the farm wife cleaned up the rest of the spilled cream, cleaned up the ashes all over the floor, got another fire going, got the cauldron on to boil water to make their lunch, prepared luncheon for take back to the farm workers, all while he sat there doing nothing. And somehow, in the midst of all that, she managed to slip down, open a new keg of ale, and bring him a frothy pint to calm him. And that day, the farmer changed, for he realized though he may sweat all day out in the fields, the real hardworking person in the family was not him, but rather it was incredibly his patient wife. That night, for the first time ever, he helped her wash the dishes after supper. And the next morning, when he went to leave for the fields, he kissed her firmly on the cheek and thanked her once again. And that year, you won't be surprised to learn that the farm workers did their best work because they weren't being yelled at all day. And the fields had a wonderful harvest, and the cows were happy, and the pig was happy, and the goats and the sheep and the chickens were happy, and the farm had its best year that it had ever had because the farmer stopped being a grump and started to practice a bit of gratitude. And though this is not a fairy tale, you will not be surprised to learn that the farmer and his wife and all of their family all lived happily ever after. I do thank you for joining us today. Keep yourself safe, and we will see you soon. Cheers.